Hey everyone, I'm Chris Luzniak,
And I'm Rob Byer, and this is
the Debate Math Podcast.
Debating Mathy Topics and Mathy Pedagogy with Mathy people just like you.
Let's get into this month's debate.
So earlier this season, we had a lovely debate on whether or not to ditch Algebra 2. And during that debate, our four lovely guests tangentially expressed four very different viewpoints on geometry.
And if you were as shocked to hear the controversy on geometry like we were, then you knew we had to get these guests back together to hear more of their thoughts on geometry. Should we keep it? Is it important? We want to dig deeper into this with today's debate. So we have two teams of two debating the resolution. It's geometry.
And our teams are a little different than last time. So here debating for the resolution that we should ditch geometry, we have two wonderful returning guests. First up is former New York City public school teacher and MFA master teacher, a Fund for Teachers Fellowship Grant recipient who studied realistic math education at the Freudenthal Institute in Utrecht, Netherlands, and who, before becoming a classroom teacher, worked at Space Camp in Huntsville, Alabama, but sadly, they've never tried zero gravity. It's returning is Kit Golan. Hi, Kit. How are you?
Hi, Chris.
Glad to have you back. And can you remind our listeners where you are and what your current role is?
Yeah, so right now I'm at Lesley University and I work as a secondary math consultant for the Center for Math Achievement. And that puts me in math classrooms around the state of Massachusetts, supporting teachers and improving their math practice.
Lovely. Well, welcome back. And arguing along with Kit is the creator of Two Kits, a national board certified math teacher, and a lover of new experiences, who's lived in 4 countries across 3 continents, taught in public, private, and international schools. She's currently on leave, but will return to the classroom in the fall of 2023. It is Mimi Yang. Hi, Mimi.
Hi. So this is my 14th year teaching in the secondary classroom. I've taught middle school and high school. And currently I'm teaching high school and loving it. And I think by the time this episode comes out, I'll be working on renewing my national board certification also. So
Nice. Can you remind us where you are real quick?
oh yeah, I'm in Seattle, Washington.
Excellent. And we're going to come back to both of you here with a question we ask all of our guests. And I know we asked this last time, but we're going to ask it again. And you can share a different story if you'd like. When has math been controversial to you? Kit, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, so I'm going to share a different story this time. I think one of the more recent times that math has become controversial for me is in hearing about people who are like the to basics group, and they're like, 2 plus 2 is always equal to 4, and math always has a right answer. And I feel like the idea that math is that flat feels controversial to me, because I can think of so many times when we have, 2 plus 2 could be 5, or I could think about modular arithmetic and maybe 2 plus 2 is not 4 at all because I'm working in binary. So thinking about what the full beauty of math is has really become like controversial for me.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And Mimi, when has math been controversial to you?
Wow, I'm going to go back. Last time I told a more recent story, but actually when I was in college, I was a STEM major. And I, my student group was doing a presentation to a bunch of professors about just recruiting like women into the STEM major and our effort around that. And after our presentation, one of the professors raised his hand and asked what we thought about, the fact that people say that women don't have the STEM brain or as much of a brain for STEM majors. And that's like, which was not in our presentation. And I was just like really surprised that somebody in the professional context could really even say that seriously, and that was the first time that, I was really kind of thinking about the controversy behind math.
Thank you both for sharing and welcome back.
Now we have a team of two arguing against the resolution. arguing that we should keep geometry. First up is a teacher who has been part of the team developing Ohio's mathematical modeling and reasoning course. Now I'm a host family to numerous international students and a lover of all things involving canning food. And co-author of the brand new Vimana Waite's pre-calculus textbook, Rachel Gorish. Hi, Rachel.
Hi. Thanks for that introduction. So at the time that this recording will come out, I will be at a new school, which is actually my old school. I'm going back to Taste Valley High School, which is just south of Columbus. But I realized my heart is in public education, especially rural education. And so I'm heading back. I get to teach data science, geometry, and Algebra 1.
Wonderful. Thank you. Welcome back. And arguing along with her is Dr. Philip Turi, who has taught and inspired educators and children for over 20 years as an educator and a consultant. He served as a visiting professor at Fordham University and was a public school teacher for over a decade. Phil has a BA in mathematics from NYU and a PhD in mathematics education from Columbia University. In addition to mathematics, teaching, and children, he loves dancing, photography, and nerdy games. Let's go.
Hey, Rob. Thanks so much for having me on the cast. And thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm coming to you from my home office in Brooklyn. When the podcast comes out, I hope to still be here. I don't have plans to go anywhere else. I am currently the owner of an educational consulting company, Ditch Consulting, where I provide guidance, professional development, academic coaching, and other services to support districts, administrators, teachers, parents, and other organizations. I'm also the director of education at PhiCycle. We are a not-for-profit, and it's our mission to work with educators, organizations, to equip all students with the mathematical and financial skills and understandings necessary to be both financially and mathematically literate.
Wonderful. Welcome back. And going back again to that first question that we always ask, but since you've been here, we're going to ask it differently. When has math been controversial to you? And Rachel, we'll start with you.
It all goes back to me being in geometry. And this is my story last time. I was taking my driver's test and the driver instructor, I don't know what they're called, the person who was judging me actually judged me in that moment and asked me, what's your favorite subject in school? And I said geometry, because I finally see myself in it. And I was so excited to tell him. And he was like, oh, girls can't do math. And I wish that controversy had ended 20 years ago. I wish that was the last time I heard that women couldn't do math. But even in the past 5 years, I was told to my face, oh, I wish my kid had a male teacher because they do better at math. And I want my daughter to not have to hear that anymore. So this controversy, it still exists, but I'm doing everything in my power to help girls who are growing up right now either know a response to that or not have to engage with that comment.
Thank you, Rachel. And Phil, when did math become controversial to you?
Thank you. So the last time I was on the cast, I was asked this question and I gave my honest response. It was a very heavy response. I talked about Bob Moses and the first time I was dumbstruck with the awesome responsibility we all have as math teachers. Today, I'm excited to be re-asked the question a second time and give a different response. The other one was like super honest, but it was heavy. And I also like this somewhat lighter story because it also really impacted me. It is the first time I was at a party and I told people I was a math teacher. Now, if I'm sure everyone listening to the cast is heavily biased and very likely to be math teachers or math lovers. So you may have had this experience also. Hey, nice to meet you. Hi, I'm Phil. What do you do? I'm a math teacher. Oh my God, really? I was horrible in math in school. I couldn't do it at all. Right. And so the first time this happened to me, I realized how broken our culture is, not school system, culture. Because at least when it comes to math, because if you're an English teacher, you don't go around at parties telling people that you teach English only to have them respond, you teach English? I can't read. I'm illiterate. I've been illiterate since high school. I'm a fully grown adult who still can't read. No one does that because no one in our society is proud to be illiterate, but they literally brag and happily, loudly pronounce that they are bad at math. So there's a couple things wrong with this that really bother me. The first is that it's not binary. You're not born good or bad at math. So let's stop pretending it is. It literally hurts people who are trying to learn math. The second thing is that if you're an adult, Can you please either just change that or stop saying it and be quiet about it? Because we should not teach children that that is something to be proud of. It is literally, again, hurting those who are trying to be good at math. So I'm just on a little mission. This is a thing. Every time you're at a party and someone says this, please steal my story and just say it to them. And no one, it's lost on no one as soon as you give the English teacher example, but it is lost on everyone up to that point. And that is a problem.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. And welcome back.
And with that, let's get into the debate. We begin with opening statements from each of our speakers. You each have 2 minutes to present your arguments. And we're starting with the side arguing for the resolution that we should ditch geometry. And Kit, you're up first. Your time begins now.
So, as it's currently taught, geometry is not a course for the modern student. There's a huge focus on Euclidean geometry. There's no mention of things like taxicab math or topology or graph theory, which are actually pretty important applications of geometry in today's modern world. And there's almost no focus on spatial concepts like perspective or viewing things from the side. And current geometry courses really focus heavily on vocabulary, notations, and formulas, rather than important geometric concepts, relationships, and applications. We're stuck doing the same thing that we've been doing since 1892. But despite being stuck in the past, we don't even contextualize the math that students are learning with the history of those topics. Why the Pythagorean theorem is even named that is beyond me, given how many cultures independently discovered that relationship. But most students just remember a formula, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, instead of understanding all of the beauty that goes into that relationship. Furthermore, with geometry topics being segregated into this separate course, it feels like a break from the rest of high school math. Students rarely transfer their knowledge from geometry to algebra courses, whereas the connections in middle school and elementary school, students get to see an integrated version of math, seeing algebra and geometry and operations all in the same course. Pushing that aside, the other piece that's a problem is that proofs get lost when they're only contained in this one course, and students don't think about how they can make proofs in other areas of math. So when we say ditch geometry, we're not talking about taking all of those topics out of the curriculum, but we're thinking about the lack of effectiveness of putting them all in one geometry course.
And now we will hear from the opposing side, arguing to keep geometry with Rachel. Rachel, you have 2 minutes and your time begins now.
So I want you to join me in my classroom, my geometry classroom, and picture this. The entire class is outside. We're all staring up at trees, creating multiple methods for determining how tall they are. You're hearing discussions from kids that remind you that our high school students have plenty of capacity for logical reasoning and thinking. Students are combining their spatial reasoning with these in-the-moment measurements, and you just see kids having these aha moments. This moment has been proudly brought to you by my geometry class. So our claim is that we need to keep geometry in the high school curriculum as its own class. And I have 3 warrants for this claim. First, the spatial reasoning that's taught in geometry is not found as easily in other courses. This real-life skill of practicing measurement and reasoning how things work within a space is critical as students grow into adults. Just the other day, I was ordering a new dryer for our house, and I needed to reason if it would fit through the doorway to get into my house and down the stairs to our basement. Where else are you going to learn this critical skill in high school math? Second, while I'm normally in favor of any integrated approach to math, I've worked with several districts they have an integrated curriculum, and what almost always happens is they downplay, almost to the point of non-existence, the role of geometry in that course. In many schools, integrated math is being treated as an algebra course with some middle school geometry topics thrown in to prep for a state test. These topics are more important than just the state test. These are the foundation for getting kids ready for pre-calculus and calculus And I don't think it's something that we should downplay by giving it a subsection in an integrated course. Third, there are so many real-world skills involved in geometry. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, Western Pennsylvania, where forestry was one of the few industries in the town I grew up in. Each forester was flawless with similar triangles because they needed to quickly calculate how far a tree needed to fall in order to safely fall without landing on very expensive machinery or people. So while you think that this is maybe like a non-relevant example for most of America, the logging industry is one of the most dangerous industries in our country. And the knowledge of geometry is literally making the workplace a little safer.
All right. And I'm going to cut you off there. Sorry, Rachel. That's your 2-minute time.
Perfect.
But great job. We got the 3 points in. We're going to jump to the other side again, the side telling us to ditch geometry with Mimi. Mimi, you have 2 minutes and your time begins now.
Thank you. Imagine being a middle school math student. You've learned a mix of algebra and some basics about segments, angles, and similarity. You're excited to see where this knowledge can be used. You enter high school only to find yourself learning about obsolete circle theorems invented by ancient mathematicians. In class, you work on 2-column proofs that feel dry and repetitive. They have particular formatting and require you to recite dozens of theorem names. None of this feels relevant to applications outside of the classroom. 9th grade is the gateway to high school. This is a time when we could be helping students to hone powerful math habits, such as pattern seeking, generalization using symbols, and forming a variety of math arguments, tools that will benefit them throughout their math career. It could be a year when students work on unfamiliar math problems in order to practice problem solving, or they could learn about real-world data analysis, thereby building their curiosity for authentic math tools. Instead, many students are stuck learning outdated concepts, and they learn it in a way that's disconnected to their future courses. Algebra 2 teachers often have to reteach algebra concepts forgotten during geometry. Pre-calculus teachers have to reteach SOHCAHTOA before introducing periodic functions. Calculus teachers need to still augment geometry by incorporating systems of equations as lead up to teaching geometric optimization. The way we're currently offering geometry is ineffective. It feels both under-challenging and out of place. Why do we offer a course that lumps all of the geometry concepts together? Pythagorean theorem, trig, volume, and surface area all are conceptually important in our continuum of concepts. We should be teaching those topics alongside related algebra skills spread over different courses. I believe that we should ditch geometry, and I hope that you will agree with Kit and me.
Thank you, Mimi. And finally, arguing again to keep geometry, we have Phil. So you have 2 minutes and your time begins now.
Thank you, Rob. If taught properly, in geometry, we learn about representing our physical world abstract. We learn how to idealize our world in order to better model it. Perfect circles and spheres don't really exist in our world, yet we study these ideals and use them to approximate real-world objects all the time. The Earth isn't a sphere, but we use a sphere to approximate it. There's a lot of mental activity to unpack in all of that. For students, this is very powerful stuff. Yes, we can engage students in mathematical modeling and other subjects too, but they need to experience these ideas in multiple settings if we expect them to internalize them. As educators, we know that mathematical modeling is an essential skill to master in high school, and that students will not master it if we don't require them to engage in these important ideas in many different contexts and often. As a math major at NYU, I was shocked that math looked nothing like high school math. I felt like I'd been duped. I had only the faintest idea of what real math looked like. Later in life, I returned to school for my PhD in mathematics education. Influenced by my undergraduate experiences, I chose to examine proof and reasoning in our curriculum for my dissertation. Proof is central to the field of mathematics. Hamio describes it as the major distinguishing component of math, further citing it as the essence of the field's uniqueness. The National Council of Mathematics Teachers, Principles and Standards for School Mathematics describes students' ability to reason and engage in proof writing as essential to understanding mathematics. Yet, in my research, I found it to largely be absent from the high school algebra curriculum. That means that geometry is the only course in high school in which students who are not destined for AP calculus are likely to experience proof. Do I like that? No. Would I be happy to debate that we should change that? Definitely. But that is the current reality. So no, I don't want to ditch the only course in high school that hints at what real mathematicians consider to be mathematics.
Thank you. All right. Wow. We hit the ground running with geometry here. And I hear a lot of the same topics coming up on both sides, like the spatial reasoning, whether or not it should be integrated or separated. And I really want to dig into the spatial reasoning part because I heard that come up a lot, and I'm hearing different opinions on that. And so maybe can you start off? You're saying there's not enough spatial reasoning, and Rachel's washer is her example of it. But what do you mean when you say there's not enough?
So for me, when I think about spatial reasoning, I think about it in reality, right? We live in 3D, we're 3D objects. And so often the only spatial reasoning that students get exposed to in their geometry class is flat on a piece of paper. And they're being asked to imagine what a 3D object might look like based on a net or based on a cross section. And students don't get enough experience with actual physical reality and then making sense of, okay, if I see a side view of something, can I predict what the 3D object would look like? Can I predict it from different angles? Or am I only able to imagine like what I see in my textbook? So I think a big piece of it for me is students are not getting enough experience actually embedded in sort of like the space we live in.
Well, I think there's definitely a piece of what Kit said. And, and when he and I were talking, we were saying like, sometimes those geometry problems sound like, what is the shortest way to get from point A to point B? But in reality, like, it's not practical to do that, to go directly from point A to B. So a lot of the problems that we deal with in geometry seem kind of contrived, even though they do have spatial reasoning. I mean, I also think depending on the teacher, one thing that is very valuable in terms of spatial reasoning is kids being able to take words, draw out diagrams to help them visualize. But the reality is that I get lots of students coming out of geometry, have taken a full year of geometry, and then I give them a word problem and they still don't diagram. I don't know exactly. Like, I think it may be getting lost in the mix of the actual skills that are being taught, like it being seen as, oh, wait, you could do it, or you don't have to do it, versus like, if that's really the spatial reasoning and the diagramming is something that we're after, you can have an introductory course in 9th grade that has really rich problems that require students to do that continuously. And that's not just, full blown geometry, right? Like there may be some geometry problems in there, but there may be other problems in there that really reinforce those foundational problem solving skills.
So let me go to the other side here, Rachel and Phil. So you think there is great spatial reasoning in there. So can you kind of share your thoughts on how it is included or what is enough about it?
Absolutely. And I think that a lot of the things you mentioned are really important. For instance, perspective drawing, orthogonal drawings, all of these things. And those are things that I've seen in almost every geometry curriculum that I've taught. The orthogonal drawings, for instance, we talk about blueprints with kids. And I think that what I hear you saying is that the missed connection is this idea of taking it from 2D into 3D, but we have to start somewhere. So a lot of geometry curriculums start with 2D representations of things and trying to understand them in that space and then move it into a 3D space. And it's like we do with every other curriculum that we have. We try to build it as we see students develop skills. Phil, anything else you would like to add?
I guess there's a lot to unpack there. With regards to spatial reasoning, I like what you said. I think, Kit, I agree with like almost everything you said in your opening statement, actually, right? Like, I think you were so on point. But I feel like you were just describing what's wrong with every high school class. The focus on equations, the focus on, like, it's not like a feature of geometry in mind. So it's this super weird thing. We had the same thing last time. We're like, I agree with everything you're saying. And I don't think I should teach geometry. Because I feel like that's a problem with all instruction that needs to be like leveled against algebra also. And like calculus, certainly, like a lot of the things you said, even some of the 2D, 3D stuff you said, right, applies to calculus, which is really interesting. I also thought that what you were saying about like, when you were like talking about it, I was like, yeah, that's true. And I was like, well, we need to be doing activities like, you have a net and you turn it into 3D shapes and you're visualizing that. And then you brought that up. And I was thinking like what you were describing, like, is the instruction, I think, at least the first part of what you were saying, is the instruction, I believe, that is meant to help students develop that spatial reasoning. And I do think that like many of the criticisms you're leveling are really good criticisms that like, yeah, I think you're right. Like geometry does focus too much on 2D. It should focus more on 3D, but I see that as a dial that we turn, like as a tweak, right? Like I actually think that if we got rid of geometry, there would be much less three-dimensional spatial reasoning in the curriculum, right? And so if we value that, the problems with geometry don't mean that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater.
I'm going to stay with Phil and Rachel for one kind of follow-up question. So I'm thinking like whether you're integrated or its own course or however we do this, you were saying like you're afraid that when it gets integrated that we kind of cut out most of the geometry topics, right? It just becomes algebra or whatever with a sprinkling of stuff. Are there things we can cut out? Like if you think about a typical geometry course, like is it too much? Are there a couple of things we could cut out or things we should definitely be adding kind of along the lines of what you're just talking about?
So I heard Mimi say we should get rid of circles. You know what? You might be right. Like we have all these theorems about circles and it has nothing in my mind. I welcome any debate on this. It has nothing in my mind to do with real life. And honestly, it's kind of like its own little chapter. And I get that we talk about tangents and a little bit of that, and it leads into some calculus, but in general, what really helps students on this pathway that we call high school math is their understanding of triangles and how they can be placed into a circle and represent the radii, but not necessarily all the secants and tangents that we deal with in a very disconnected way in geometry. So maybe we could get rid of that part of the course so that we could focus more on what Phil was talking about, this proof and reasoning part of geometry that's so rich. I love the spatial reasoning stuff. Everything that you said you want in a geometry class is in my geometry class. That's along with the Ohio State standards, but it's also because I feel passionate about helping students understand this and explore it in a way that's really meaningful, that they can make connections. But it has to be meaningful and they have to make connections if I want them to write proofs about it. And I think that that's ultimately one of the purposes of being a mathematician is finding your truth and being able to write logically about it. And in order to do that, you do need to have some background information. And that doesn't just come out of the ether. We have to share with one another because we believe that everyone should be part of our field and that it shouldn't be just for some elite mathematicians. We need to share this knowledge that we have about mathematics with anyone who wants to listen to it. And sometimes students don't want to listen to it, but they get a chance to hear about it too. And maybe at some point they'll be ready.
I'm just curious, like with that in mind, what things do you definitely want to keep? Whether geometry is its own course or not. So like Rachel's like, okay, get around circles. Like there's some things we could trim. Is there like a core of what geometry is that you think, well, even if we integrate it and don't teach a full course of it, what really has to be there?
So I'm actually in agreement with Rachel and Phil that the reasoning behind proofs is very important. I think that should be very important in all of our classes. My criticism for the proofs in geometry is that they only do one type of proof. It's mainly just 2-column proofs, and it's a lot of it is like triangular proofs, and they don't do any like proof by contradiction or I don't think there's most geometry courses get into like proving by induction, and so I think that logical piece is very important. But instead of kind of really going going in deep on a 2-column proofs, we should really have a survey of different logical argument types in the course, and to allow students to see like when one would be more useful than another. And again, that could happen in any course. We could decide, in other courses that is more appropriate place to place them, but I don't think it should be taken out of the high school curriculum.
I'd love to jump in here actually and just point out that so much of what we think of as geometry, much like with our last debate, might be ill-defined and different in all of our minds. I cannot fathom a geometry course that does not start with proof by contradiction. I cannot fathom it, right? And to you, you're like, most don't include it. And I'm not denying what you're saying. I just think it like underscores the different perspectives we might have around this, and the fact that maybe we were super clear about the fact that Algebra 2 in our last debate was an ill-defined course. Maybe geometry is less defined than we thought, despite being such a stalwart of the American math high school curriculum. Because hearing you talk, like I know from talking to Rachel that she also feels that way. Or like along those lines. And so, like I never taught 2-column proofs in my geometry courses. I used flowchart proofs and paragraph proofs. I was mortified when I got to NYU and my professors acted like 2-column proofs were childish. And I was vindicated to a certain extent and happy when I learned that 2-column proofs were invented to help it make it easier for professors to grade proofs. And right. And so like, I definitely think that a lot of reform needs to be done, right? So for instance, just to give you an example of the vision for geometry that I would have, right? Nothing could be more contrived than less real math than given, blah, prove, blah. You know it's true, prove. That is not how real proofs happen. Usually we are like trying to decide if the thing we're trying to prove is true. We are making conjectures and playing with it, right? In real math, you often don't set out with the givens that you're going to need, right? Things like that. And so the way we teach proofs has lots of problems. It's very contrived. To think about a geometry course, though, gives all of the tools to engage our students in those ideas in a real way. So for instance, you can use constructions, right? You can engage your students in constructions, and you can give your students a side, and an angle, and ask them all to construct a triangle. And they can disprove someone who thinks side angle is a triangle congruency, because among 30 kids, you're going to get 2 triangles, right? You're very unlikely to have them all just happen to make one. Although there is one that's much easier to construct. If you do it with 30, you'll get 2, right? And the kids can say like, oh, this can't be a triangle congruency. Whereas when you give them side, you can engage them. They can all go, wow, 30 people all made the same triangle. And then you go, and you know what? Here's all the triangles from my other classes. Every person in the 10th grade made the same triangle, the exact same triangle. And then we can have a discussion. Is that enough to prove that it's a congruency? No, that's a deep discussion, right? And then, but it is enough to hint at the fact that maybe we should explore if this is a triangle congruency. Anyway, so I just think like this is a topic that you can teach in so many different ways. And I think that our case rests on the idea that geometry gives us all the tools to do it well, not the idea that everyone is already doing it well.
Yeah, do you want to add anything?
I feel like, Phil, what you said about us agreeing last time and this time is definitely very true. I would say that you might notice I did not switch sides. I'm very consistently in favor of ditching everything that's in high school math right now, because I think that the way that it is arranged leads to the pedagogy not changing. And a lot of what I hear you talking about is the kind of pedagogy that I think is necessary for high school math, but isn't there. And if we keep doing things the way that we've been doing them, teachers are less likely to innovate or to change anything about their practice. And in my opening, I referenced 1892. That's when the Committee of 10 decided what topics should be taught in high school. And they came up with algebra, geometry, and then advanced algebra and trig. And it wasn't until Sputnik that calculus got added. But that's 1892. Why are we in 2023 still doing this same sequence? I think it's time for an update.
So, along with the update, I kind of want to do a callback to Rachel's opening statement too. Rachel you mentioned like a tree falling, like doing, with lumber. And it's funny because recently I just had a tree, taken down in my backyard, and the gentleman that came in the backyard, he looked at the tree, he looked at the back shed, and he goes, "Yeah, I can lay this down right here." I mean, and he was able to do it so quickly. So I'm wondering if, like, in like a high school geometry class, if we should do more that leans towards like professionals, like, or, things like having the right HVAC, uh, having capacity versus volume of a room, and, being able to select something like that, or, being able to, select enough paint to paint 4 walls and a room. And even though that might be more of a middle school feel, but like, could we expand on that? Is that something that the four of us could kind of talk about and maybe make it a little bit more, concrete and real for professionals? So Rachel and Phil, I'm going to kind of start with you because Rachel, you started with the whole tree thing.
So I definitely think that all of mathematics should have more opportunities for students to see it in the real world and as a viable part of any profession. So absolutely, I think that that's really exciting. And I think that it pairs with this logical reasoning part. So if I have to paint a room as part of like learning about area and 3D space, and then I have to create a budget for it. And then I have to justify to someone else why this is the budget that I need for this project. I think that that's getting at some of this logical reasoning. And so this is something I do with my students when we talk about area. We want to create a more real life situation. No, none of them are going to go home and paint their bedrooms tonight. But I have been like that person who bought a new house and I had to paint it myself because that's the only way we were going to have money to do it. And I think it's a good skill. The fact that they're trying to justify their budget, I think brings in that logical reasoning that we really want kids to do too. In preparation for today, I was trying to think. I was like, respect Kit, and Kit is on this call right now. I was like, why don't we just put all geometry in middle school? Like, can't you learn everything in middle school like that you need for geometry? And I was like, what would he say to that? And what would I say in response? So I started looking at the Van Healy models, which is what the Ohio standards are for geometry. They're based on the Van Healy model. And what they realized is students, for the most part, don't have this logical reasoning and deduction skill yet until they reach the high school level. It's part of their brain development. And so I think that having these real life activities and having the mental capacity to reason through it and having these experiences in geometry is just like a winning combination that we should do really intentionally. And I'm blessed to know a lot of geometry teachers who are doing that and taking advantage of it and spurring me on to do even more of that in my classroom.
Are you saying ditch middle school geometry? Is that what I'm hearing? Are we shifting this completely? And Phil, I want to give you a chance too. How else can we bring some more like real world application to the geometry class to maybe make it to where geometry as it stands may need a shift, and how can we make it better for our kids?
So it's actually, it's an interesting question. I'm really, from the last call or the last podcast, I'm very into having mathematics be very relevant and applied for our students. It's a challenge to make it relevant to their lives a lot of the times because they're not working, they're going to school every day, right? So like if I were to relate reality to Fortnite, is that gonna achieve what we're talking about? I'm sorry about, I'm not sure. So when I think about geometry, I think about in preparation for this like podcast, I was talking to people about it. Talking about like the ditch geometry, don't ditch geometry, asking people what they thought. It's genuinely interesting for me. That's why we're all on this call, right? And I talked to a teacher who had been in the Navy through the 2000s. And when I told her we were talking about ditching geometry, she was like flabbergasted that we would do it. I was like, what do you mean? She's like, it's so important. It's so real world. And she's like giving me all these examples from the Navy where they used it. And the one that stuck with me most was she was talking about how when they refuel, two ships have to get really close to each other and stay parallel. And that the way they keep them parallel, I'm sure someone's going to like comment that maybe this has been updated, but even in the 2000s was a physical table and two people measuring the alternate interior angles and communicating to make sure they had the same alternate interior angle. And she described this as like an all hands on deck thing with like an alert thing, like everyone was ready because if it was a crash, people would die. It was like a really serious thing. And so, she used to, this is a life or two that she used to say that to her kids that like alternate interior angles was like a life or death topic. And so when I think about that, on one hand, I'm like, well, that's very relevant. We should put examples like that in it. Like, if nothing else, that captures my attention. On the other hand, like that's not really relevant to my life if I'm in high school. And I think that's one of the challenges of all of this stuff, right? In our last podcast, I advocated for making Algebra 2 like a financial literacy course, which was very applied, which I do think students see as relevant to their lives, right? But I actually think I'm hard pressed to find like enough consistent topics, right? So maybe geometry should be an architecture course. I'm actually not an architect. I can't say if I could design that full course, right? But I do think that it behooves us to try to make it as real and relevant for our students. It's definitely something everyone on this call wants, I think. How to do it, I think, is to try to be real world and to try to be relevant. So, the example I gave, maybe it does have a place in a geometry textbook because we think it would capture students' attention. But like, they're definitely not going to go home and keep boats parallel using a cable. So I also concede that point without someone on the other side needing to say it. like I think we have to search for the sweet spot that's interesting, compelling, but also relevant, right? Remember, according to most theories of motivation, in order to be intrinsically motivated, which is what we want for our students, they need to see things as both interesting and important, right? And I think that we can make a case. I can make a pretty easy case for geometry being interesting. I think we can make a case for it being important. If we were all going to sit around and design a course, I think the challenge would be to make those two things cohesive. And so I think geometry is important. I think geometry is interesting. I don't have in my back pocket the course that makes it a cohesive, unified topic that we can study, right? Maybe it needs to be a survey. Maybe it needs to jump around. I'm not sure about that, but I do know we need those features, and I think geometry has them.
Well, and then going to the other side, and I'm wondering now, if like geometry could be split into two separate geometry courses. And I want to ask Mimi and Kid about this, because there's one that's like the application with, like laying a tree down or painting rooms or carpeting or something like that. But also within computer science, even, like there's so much geometry and video gaming and creating the video games. And I'm wondering if we were to reimagine, geometry as, something that's more real world applicable. And then also that's like, the blue collar, the work with your hands, but then also like having like a computer science version, like teaching geometry and geometric concepts through the computer science. Would that be something that you could get on board with? And if not, why?
Yeah, I love the examples that Rachel and Phil gave about where geometry is used. The concepts I think are really just, there is that practical half of it. I took a sewing class some years ago, and then the person was teaching how to make these skirts with a particular circumference. And instead of using any math in her class, she was like, I just try it. I try it, and then it doesn't work. So then I try a different number, and then it doesn't work. And then I just keep trying. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is like a basic circumference formula. She could just take whatever she wants and then just calculate it. But instead, she just does trial and error. And I think, even a little bit of like geometry being like a project-based class can really just kind of highlight those connections for folks who are, she's doing this all the time and not making the connection to geometry. My husband, who is a computer programmer, he has used a lot of geometry in his actual like work, and he built the software where basically he needed to use like geometry to figure out when people click on different things, how do you know what they're clicking on? And so how close is it to the object that's actually on screen? It's all like math, right? But it's not math, but it's not geometry that we learned in high school. It's like a lot more advanced than what we learned in high school. And so I think having a course that makes some of those connections really explicit for students can help it feel relevant, because he couldn't just take like the distance formula from high school and just program it. It's a lot more than that.
So I want to jump in here because I feel like so much has been said and so many ideas have popped into my mind. The first thing, somebody, I think it was Rachel, mentioned something about like house buying, and I'm currently house hunting, and I just bought like a laser measure, and my laser measure is so fancy that it does the Pythagorean theorem for me. It can calculate the area of a room for me. It can calculate the volume of a room for me. And so I think this, like the existence of a tool like this, points out why just simply number chugging and using formulas is not what geometry should be about. My tool can do that part for me, but understanding, well, should I be using the area or the volume here? Because I'm trying to figure out how much paint I need or how much I can fit in my storage unit. And yes, my storage unit, I can fit in 3 dimensions, right? Like those are the kinds of spatial experiences that our students need. And I think to Rachel's point about like middle school versus high school, when does geometry happen or when can it happen? I don't think students in middle school or elementary school are ready for the level of formality that high school students are, just as you said, developmentally. But I do think there's not enough physical experiences for those students in elementary and middle school that develop the kind of geometrical and spatial senses that's needed for a lot of the stuff that you're talking about in high school. And I think that, we're talking specifically about ditching high school geometry. My point is we need to be doing more geometry everywhere, because here's a great example. I work with some 7th grade teachers, and 7th graders are thinking about angle relationships and angles and using protractors. Well, this current year's 7th graders were in 4th grade during the 2019-2020 interrupted school year. That's the first time they're introduced to protractors, and they don't see them again until 7th grade. So literally these 7th graders were like, yeah, we've never seen those tools before in our lives. No idea what those are. And they're now having to learn what a protractor is. Why are we just segmenting? Okay, you get all of your geometry stuff in 10th grade or 9th grade, and then never again. Why aren't we making those connections more explicit? The other thing is, why are we not giving students enough experience with the kinds of geometric tools that they might actually use in reality, right? We're talking about like compasses and protractors and constructions. I know that when I go to physical therapy, my physical therapist uses an angle ruler to measure like how far a joint can extend. And that's a better version of a protractor and a ruler. Whereas students rarely ever see that tool in class. But here's a perfect example of where that tool that you could use in class is also used in the real world. So I think that when Mimi and I say ditch geometry, again, we're not saying geometry as a topic is not valuable or important. We're saying that what we focus on in high school geometry is not what the modern student needs, and it's not what's going to engage them. I also was thinking, as people were talking about engaging students, how one of the things that fascinates me are tessellations and MC Escher's artwork. And I love all of the tiling problems. And there's a like made up shape called polyominoes. And there's lots of actual open, unsolved math problems about that's considered recreational math. And so to your point, Phil, of like geometry is this opportunity for students to see more real math. Why aren't we giving students more opportunities to see the beauty of real math, where they could delve into these unanswered questions and not just be doing a proof where I've got to show something that everybody already knows is true using a bunch of things I'm supposed to memorize?
You really need to get a background that communicates your love for these things.
For those of you who can't see it, because you're just listening, I've got a geometry background because I love geometry.
And it's
Not
beautiful.
the way it's taught.
I have one last question kind of for everyone here, just kind of thinking about in terms of like advice to teachers. I worry about like Kit and Mimi when you're talking about, not having a full geometry course, but kind of putting it in with algebra and integrating it like that. I worry about it becoming forgotten or not as rigorous or like, an afterthought. And Rachel and Phil, same thing, like someone who likes this idea of integrating it, but their course teaches whole course of it, and they just kind of just go back to the basics, boring stuff, right? Pythagorean theorem, whatever. I'm just wondering from all of you, we'll go around the room here. Just like, what advice do you have? Like, how do we keep it rigorous, keep the bar high so students are learning and challenged and enriched, without, just becoming a secondary thing or becoming a really dry thing?
I mean, I could jump in. I think, ideally, by kind of sprinkling the topics into different courses, you would actually create more space because algebra teachers after geometry don't have to reteach some of the topics. Like you could just kind of keep up or develop the algebra knowledge, continue to do that in 9th grade. So 10th grade doesn't feel like, oh, you've kind of set back from where you were in 8th grade. I think like any curriculum, you want to have really articulated standards internal to your school that make sense for your schedule. And you want to like ideally if you're splitting up the geometry course, you want to take those assessments that you've already created that are presumably assessing those sort of project-based learning, and you want to sprinkle them into the courses that you're moving those topics to so that you're not, like you said, losing rigor along the way. And those projects that you've created should also move along to those other courses.
I will jump in here. I have literally been in multiple math departments who have cheered when they figured out a way to subvert the geometry curriculum and keep teaching algebra in 10th grade. Literally, they're like, that's a great idea. We'll just do it all in the coordinate plane. And then they could just do algebra more because that's all we care about because of the test. And in New York State, at least, this is in New York State. I don't think it's unique to New York State, but I have to just say, because I know we have an international audience, that I am talking about schools in New York, right? So that is a huge problem to me. And I think that like the thing that Rachel alluded to, which is that like it just gets watered down to the point where it doesn't exist. The thing you're talking about reminds me of what at least New York State has done with probability. Probability has just been appended to the end of every topic in algebra. And as a result, kids don't really know probability because it doesn't, like the idea of peppering it everywhere ends up diluting it everywhere. And they never give it a proper treatment. And not that that has to happen, but that is my fear and what I would expect to happen. So as an educator, you can imagine that I think the answer to this problem is education. So of teachers, in this case, I believe what we are experiencing is that teachers are bad at proof and do not recall doing constructions because in their own education, they did very little of it. And then this problem is being perpetuated when they get to high school and they're asked to teach geometry and they have to make decisions about what to cut. And what do they cut? They cut down on proof and they cut down on constructions. Why? Well, it's probably not going to be on a test. And if it is, they're not going to get those points. Not that I believe that, right? But that's the narrative of what sometimes gets put forward. And so I think what we have happening here is the same problem that we have that has been documented in elementary school, where teachers aren't comfortable with math and they devote less class time to math, right? Or the younger grades. And I fear that that's actually exactly what's happening with geometry. If you think about it, like when you get to college, if you didn't know algebra, what do? They make you take high school algebra. If you didn't know geometry, what do? They don't even know that you didn't know geometry. Right? And I think that's a big part of the problem.
Yeah, I'm going to have you go because as a geometry teacher, I want to, I guess, get the last word. That's so terrible. But go ahead, Kit.
It's all right. I tried to talk before Phil and then I was like, no, I'll let him go. So it's totally fine. I think, Phil, in some ways, right, I agree with what you're saying, that I'm worried teachers will not do the topics due diligence. But I think that that's a result of our curriculum standards still being too wide. I think that we're trying to cover too much in grades K through 12, and we're not covering the right things, and we're not doing it in the right ways. And we're not providing the sorts of experiences that our students and also our teachers need in order to become comfortable with the concepts, right? We talked a lot about making things tangible for students today. And I think to your question, Chris, I would recommend any math teacher, no matter what content, make it physical, right? Engage students in more than just two-dimensional reasoning on flat paper. Even if I'm just reasoning about these angles, right? I've got my pattern blocks that I'm pulling out and playing with because I'm seeing connections and I'm seeing relationships that don't come to life when they're just flat on my textbook page. I think when it comes to getting students and teachers to feel like they can really go in depth with some of this, the next sort of conversation that our country needs to have is what standards can we cut? Because I think that we have too much in K-12 to do really well on any of them.
I knew I was wise to wait to the end because it's a yes and. Yes, what Mimi said. Yes, what Phil said. And yes, what Kit said. Because absolutely, we need all of those things. And that's what's in my heart as a geometry teacher. So thank you for making 3 of my points for me. I appreciate you all. One thing we haven't talked at all about, and this would help us a lot with time and looking for a lot of structure, is technology. We need to educate teachers about the dynamic geometry software we have so that they can be more comfortable with it, so they can help students be more comfortable with it, so that they can literally build some of these ideas and start to make conjectures from that. So happy to help anyone who wants to learn more about dynamic geometry. I am on Twitter. Like, honestly, if my inbox is full of DMs after this podcast comes out, I will be delighted because I want to help with GeoGebra and the Inspire. And Desmos just had a new geometry beta version come out, and go play around with it, fail, and then revise and succeed. And I'm excited for you to learn more. I think we do need a lot of time to build these structures and routines, which is why I'm advocating for a whole course in this. I don't want it glossed over. I think teachers need more time, students need more time to literally and physically build, like Kit said. And finally, I want to be part of the solution. So if you want activities to use in your geometry classroom, tell me what your topic is. I'll send you an idea and we can even work on it together, because I want to be part of the solution. I think that education is going to get better from passionate educators sharing ideas. And so I'm on Twitter, and I hope you seek me out and we can work on something together.
Wonderful. And that ends our question. All right. And thank you, all 4 of you. Well, that concludes our debate. That was a great note to end on. And you've given us lots to think about, lots to talk about, lots to tweet about. I love it.
And now it's up to our listeners to take a moment, ponder the arguments, and consider what resonated with you. Should we ditch algebra? Not algebra, but should we ditch geometry? Be sure to go to our Twitter at DebateMathPod to share your thoughts on this debate. Should we ditch geometry?
And a huge thanks to all 4 of our guests for coming back and taking on a different topic, changing teams because you had different thoughts on this topic. And you just showed the way you agree and listen to each other, like what great, thoughtful adult discourse can be. I love it. Thank you so much.
And thanks to all those who are listening. Hope you enjoyed and learned from this episode.
And as we wrap up, Kit, where can listeners find you?
So listeners can find me on Twitter at Mr. Kit Math, or Gmail, mrkitmath@gmail. And if you live in the New England area, I'll probably be presenting right around the time this podcast comes out at the Mini conference in Maine.
Wonderful. And Mimi, where can listeners find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Until Next Stop.
And Rachel, where can listeners find you?
You can also find me on Twitter at Rachel, Rachael H. Gorsuch. And I hope that you will reach out because I want to share ideas and collaborate with y'all.
And Phil, where can listeners find you?
You can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn at Phil Dituri. That's PhilDituri. You can learn more about the financial literacy curriculum and math class that I helped to author at ficycle.org. That's FICYCLE.org. And if you are interested in working with me as a consultant for speaking, professional development, or other services, you can find me at dituriconsulting.com. That's DITURI consulting.com.
Wonderful. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, everyone.
Want to learn more about incorporating debate activities into your math classroom? Go to luzniak.com/podcast to sign up for my mailing list and get your first set of example debate activities you could use with your students today. Go to luzniak.com/podcast.
Don't forget to reach out to us with comments and questions on debatemath.com or follow us on Twitter at debatemathpod and follow along with #debatemathpod.
Rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts.
Or wherever you listen to this podcast. Your feedback is super important to us.
Well, that's all from us.
Looking forward to debating with you more next episode. Until next time, cheers.